Well, hey guys, thanks for clicking on that video thumbnail and checking out Next Level Carpentry, where in this video, I'm going to show you how to build some pretty sweet pullouts, like the ones I made recently to help organize the side cabinet on this rolling tool chest. I made 4 individual pullouts to replace 2 flat shelves that were adjustable for height because I wanted better access to the things stored in this cabinet. With the stationary shelves, I always had to dig through stuff in the front to get the stuff in the back. But because I put these pullouts on full extension glides, I can quickly and easily access stuff all the way at the back of the cabinet, all the way at the back of the bottom, where it comes to the pullout on the bottom here, so that I can store things I don't use a lot, but I have easy access to them. And you'll also notice that these are self-closing glides, so it's super quick and easy to access stuff on each one of these trays, put them away, close the cabinet, and get back to work. And I decided to do a video about this for YouTube because there was a few challenges of getting a pullout to work in a metal cabinet. There's shelf standards inside and little clips and channels in there that need to be worked around to make a pullout function here. And I wanted to share the things I came up with to work around those design challenges, because pullout storage is so much more efficient than shelf storage. And I wanted to help viewers get around the frustration I had with inefficient storage in this otherwise useful cabinet. So let's dive right in and I'll show you how it's done. And the first challenge is to come up with a way to mount the full extension glides on the inside of a metal cabinet. Glides like this are designed to install up against the flat inside of a cabinet, where on a metal cabinet like this, there is no flat inside. There's a channel in the front, there's ribs on the sides where shelf clips go, and there's various rivets, etc. inside the cabinet, so it's not a nice clean surface like in a regular cabinet made in a cabinet shop. Another thing is, these are Master Force cabinets. I got those at Menards quite some time back, and I was able to make mounting boards for inside this cabinet, but every cabinet manufacturer is going to have a different configuration inside there. But from what I'll show you, I'm sure that you can extrapolate what I came up with to whatever configuration is inside the cabinet you're trying to work with. So let me show you what I came up with so you can see how it needs to look for these full extension drawer glides to work. And I'll just pull one of these out so you can see what it needs to look like. And if you're not familiar with these type of glides, there's a little clip or a little pull on each side of the glide that you just move to release, and the pull-out comes right out. This one comes out easily even though it's fully loaded. And you can see how the glides just slide easily in and out because of the block I made inside to hold those glides. So let's take a closer look. And what you're looking at here is a block of wood with some notches that fit the contour of the side of the cabinet. The glide is just screwed to that wooden block. And in this case, there's a notch in the front for a steel channel that makes the face frame of this cabinet. There's a 2-inch wide notch here that holds shelf clips. That's what this channel's for. There's one of these in the front, and there's another one in the back. And for the drawer glide to work, it has to mount against the side of the cabinet. And you can see that there's nothing even to mount it on. And so what this block does in essence is make up the difference between the side of the cabinet and the edge of this face frame. And here's what one of those blocks looks like. This is just made up of maple. Those pieces in there are made out of cherry. It's just pallet wood, and they're made to fit the depth of the cabinet. These cabinets are 23.5 inches full depth, so that's about how long this is. And then you can see the notches in the back for those rails that hold the shelf clips. And there's some bevels on here so that I can get this in and out of the cabinet. And for this particular cabinet, these are 1 1/8 inches thick, because that's the distance from the sheet metal side of the cabinet to this face frame. And I want the drawer glides to be able to slide past that face frame and be parallel to each other, which is parallel to the sides of the cabinet. And so that's the 1 1/8 inches thickness of the block. It's 23.5 inches long to fit front to back. And the other thing for these particular drawer glides, now there's a lot of hardware out there on the market, but it's a pretty standard measurement. These are about 1 3/4 inches, and then the screw holes are centered up in that, so 7/8 from the top and from the bottom. But I made these blocks exactly 2 inches for reasons you'll see later. That allows me to mount the hardware to the block so it's closer to the top edge than the bottom edge, and that leaves clearance for the bottom pullout in the cabinet, which will make sense later. But let me show you how this fits into the cabinet. And this is a little tricky to show in the camera because of the constraints of the cabinet itself and the difficulty of lighting, but here's the strip that I made, and because there's a channel on the front of this tool chest, I put a notch in the front so that this slips behind, and it's a pretty snug fit, but you can also see that there's rivets here that hold the hinge on. I need to avoid that, but this notch fits behind the face frame, and then these slots here fit around the channels on the side of the cabinet. And you can see how it fits here. There's the front notch, the front channel, and then in the back of the cabinet, there's the notch for the back. And then on the very end of this, I put a bevel on there so that this piece can slide into place and not jam against the back of the cabinet. But it is a snug fit against the sheet metal on the back of the cabinet. You can see that piece holds itself in place because there's pressure here at the front notch that sandwiches that in, and then the length is such that it stays in place at the back of the cabinet. And that's very helpful, but it's not actually essential. So that's what the blocks look like for this particular cabinet. If somebody's got a Master Force cabinet and want those dimensions, I could pass them along. But like I said, every cabinet manufacturer, those dimensions and properties are going to be a little bit different. But the takeaway is that the thickness of this block holds it out past this rail. You can see here that the square slides right past because that thickness is what it needs to be. And that allows the drawer glides to fit in between here without being pinched or interrupted by the face frame. And luckily for me, both sides of this cabinet are the same. So the same block works on both sides. And put another one in here for a matching pair. And once those are installed, they're perfectly parallel to each other. They're flush with this face frame so that the drawers fit nicely in between there. And as long as I've got the camera set up here, I'll show you one more thing. I'll show you making these blocks later, but I didn't want to screw these blocks into the side of the cabinet. I don't want screws coming out the outside of the cabinet, and I didn't want to screw into the blocks from the outside of the cabinet. So I just made this little piece here. The space from here to here is equal to the space from there to there. And these little ears just keep this piece in place. I set it on top of the blocks in the back and just snap it into place, and that holds these blocks at the right distance apart at the back that matches the distance apart at the front. Everything is held in place. You'll see later I have support blocks under here that holds these glides or these blocks in their vertical position, so I don't need any screws at all to attach these into the cabinet. And that keeps me from spoiling the cabinet with extra screw holes, etc. And it also allows me infinite adjustability of the position for these pullouts so that I can make them any height and depth I want. The pieces just pop right out of there if I need to remove them for any reason. And if I change the configuration, all I need to do is swap these parts out, and I won't have a bunch of extra screw holes in the blocks or in the cabinet, making it kind of an unsightly mess, which I try to avoid when possible. I'll come back later in the video with more information about the glides when I actually install them. But for now, I reinstall the glides on their blocks and the top two pullouts into the cabinet to free up space in the shop and talk a little bit more about making the hardware mounting blocks for inside the cabinet. When making these blocks, be prepared to spend a little bit of extra time figuring out the dimensions and the configuration so that you get a nice fit inside the cabinet. And on this stuff, I used some old pallet wood, making sure it was thick enough and wide enough and long enough for the job. And I made a prototype so I could practice with the various notches and angle cuts so that these pieces would snap into the cabinet. And naturally, I used standard millwork practices to flatten, straighten, and thickness plane the material, and then used the dado blade for making these various notches. And I made a repeat setup so that I could make 16 of these blocks all at the same time, enough for 4 pullouts in each of the cabinets. And because every cabinet's going to be a little bit different, be prepared to spend time figuring out angles and dimensions so that those fit nice. And once you've got the blocks made so that they fit nice in the cabinet, it's time to move on to the next step, which is making the pullouts themselves. The pullout making process starts by measuring the exact width and depth of the cabinet you're working with. And in this case, the width is 12 7/8 inches and the overall depth is 23.5 inches. And I'll make a couple comments here in case you haven't had a lot of experience building cabinet drawers, and after all, pullouts are just kind of specialized cabinet drawers. And the first thing is the exact width measurement there is 12 7/8 inches. And with this type of hardware, it's very common for side mount drawer hardware to require 1 inch of space. So the maximum width for a pullout in a 12 7/8 inch wide opening is 11 7/8 inches. But experience tells me that you're way better off having the pullouts a little bit narrow than a little bit wide. So I'll end up making these a little more than 12 3/4, about 12 13/16, to have just a little bit of wiggle room and play room in there so that the glides, especially the self-closing part, operate smoothly. The other thing is the cabinet depth. The absolute maximum in that cabinet is 23.5 inches. And drawer glides basically come in 2-inch increments. And that's called a 24-inch cabinet. It's only 23.5. But the drawer glides obviously need to be shorter than the space of the cabinet. So these are 22-inch glides. There's a little bit of space at the back of the cabinet. I put that 1/4-inch melamine spreader in between the glides. That's one thing. And there again, a little extra room is always better than not quite enough. So in this case, I'm going to make the drawers 23 inches deep. And even though that's 1 inch longer than these 22-inch glides, when in fact 22-inch glides in this case are about 21 3/4 inches long. So there's some wiggle room there, and depending on what parameters you're working with, you might have to make different choices for the hardware. But keep those factors in mind so that you don't build a pullout that won't work. Now we'll cover design and construction of the pullout itself. So I remove one from the cabinet and unload the contents to give you a better look. And I'll start by verifying those dimensions with the sides exactly 23 inches long and the total width at exactly 11 3/4 inches. Overall width and depth of the pullouts is determined by the cabinet they're going in, but the height is determined by what's going to be stored in the pullout itself. And for this video, I'm making 3 pullouts, and they're all going to be 10.5-inch sides, and that accounts for a 1/2 inch bottom and then 10 inches of space for what goes in here. I've got a lot of rattle can spray paint and adhesive that needs to go in these pullouts, some of the other automotive products in there, and 10 inches is a good overall height, so it covers a wide range of products. The other thing about the pullouts is, from the beginning, I've wanted to design them so that they take up a minimum amount of space inside the cabinet. So I've chosen 1/4-inch material for the sides. And in this case, I've got 1/4-inch Russian birch plywood because I wanted to use a classic gray stain to go with the laminate I have for the bottoms. And those bottoms are laminate covered because various oils and glues and stuff can spill on there, and I want them to be able to clean off. But other 1/4-inch material could be used for the sides, as could thicker material, 1/2 inch or something, but the wider the material, the heavier the pullouts are going to be, and the less storage space you're going to get. So now that I've established the size of these side pieces, I'm going to go ahead and cut those out of a 5x5 sheet of 1/4-inch Russian birch plywood. Cutting large sheets down to size in a small shop can be a big job for one person, so I strategically place my Grote tangent wrap outfeed roller stands around the table saw so that I can quickly handle an otherwise demanding job. And with the helping hands of my Grote roller stands, I cut all 6 sides for 3 pullouts quickly, precisely, and most importantly, safely. And FYI, if you're interested in more in-depth information and pro tips for cutting large sheet goods down into parts for drawers, you can check out the video link here to the video I did for professional grade cabinet drawers. But now that I've got the sides cut for these pullouts, it's time to put this parabolic notch into the corner. And for these sides that are 10.5 inches tall, this arc is 4 inches vertically and 8.5 inches horizontally. And to do a quick job of drawing that, I'm going to create an ellipse stick at the drill press. To make the ellipse stick, I start with a straight scrap stick and draw a center line end to end. Next, I make 3 marks along that center line, measuring from one end. First measuring 1 inch, then another 4 inches, and 8.5 more inches after that. These 3 marks correspond with the 4-inch vertical and 8.5-inch horizontal proportions for the parabolic notch on the side of the pullout. Now, to create the ellipse stick, I first drill a 5/16 inch hole through the middle mark on the stick for a sharp writer pencil. Then I quickly swap bits on my Lambrick keyless chuck and drill a tiny hole in each of the end marks, where I'll soon drive finish nails for guiding the stick. Once the holes are drilled in the stick, I drive a long straight finish nail through the holes on the ends, place a piece of masking tape over the 5/16 hole, and push a Papermate sharp writer pencil through the tape for a snug fit in that center hole. And that completes setup for the ellipse stick I'll use for drawing this arc. Drawing a perfect parabolic curve with this method couldn't be easier. I'll put a vertical mark at 4 inches and a horizontal mark at 8.5 inches for reference, so you can see just how slick this works. And now, to use the stick to draw the arc, I place the nails along the top edge of the pullout with the 4-inch end of the stick towards the back of the pullout side, so that the pencil is lined up on the 8.5-inch mark, and draw the arc by simply sliding the nails along the top and front edge of the pullout side so that the pencil point draws a perfect parabolic curve, connecting the point on the top edge of the side to the point on the front edge of the side. The sharp pencil point is fragile, so I've got to take a little care to keep from snapping the lead, but the result is a perfect parabolic curve for the notch on the front of this pullout side.
That was easy.
Once the arc is drawn, it's over to the bandsaw, where I cut away the waste close to the line, and then switch to the drill press with a sanding drum to fine-tune the pattern for this arc. And if you think this sanding drum assortment thing is cool, I can tell you that patrons of Next Level Carpentry on Patreon got an in-depth look of the design and creation of this handy sanding drum organizer. But more to the point, I'm choosing the 2-inch drum with an 80 grit sleeve for cleaning up the curve on the pullout side. And here you get another close-up view of the slick Lambrick keyless chuck that I have on my Powermatic drill press that makes such quick work of swapping bits to drums on a project like this, where I use various bits and attachments to get the job done. To finish up the pullout side pattern, I use a sharp writer pencil to trace around a small socket to create a radius that will ease the sharp corners on the top edge of the Russian birch plywood sides. And then head back over to the drill press to shape those rounded corners with the 80 grit sanding drum to create a pleasing profile on this pullout side pattern. Next, to make this pattern both accurate and easy to use, I put marks 3 inches up from the bottom edge and 3/8 of an inch in from both the front and back that will serve both to attach the pattern to each of the blanks and also a center hole for screws later in the build. And while I'm at it, I'll add marks for 2 more holes along the back edge of the pattern that will come into play later in the build as well. Each of these holes will be along that same line 3/8 of an inch in from the back end of the pullout side, with the top mark 3/4 of an inch down from the top edge and the other mark centered up in between the two at 3 3/8 inches. Next, I chuck a number 58 bit from an index numbered 1 through 60 into a pin vise that I'll use in the drill press to pilot holes through each of the 4 locations in the pattern for this pullout side. And these pilot holes serve as straight guides for both attaching the pattern to each of the side blanks and also for center holes for aluminum bar hardware that act as guardrails in the front and back of these pullouts later. As I stop and think about it, it seems like this is an awful lot of steps just to make sides for a simple pullout. And I hope that all these extra steps and measures I'm taking make sense as the build progresses, because even though this takes a long time to demonstrate in a video, these steps really do speed up the process of making perfectly accurate and consistent pieces for these pullouts. And the more pullout sides you're making, the more worthwhile each of these steps is, because it speeds up the process. But as it is, I'm taking the one pattern now and I'll lay it on top of each of the blanks next to the fence here as a guide, and carefully but quickly trace around the profile of the pattern onto each of the blanks as the next step in the process. And if I were making dozens of these instead of just a half a dozen, I could surely come up with a way of gang cutting these pieces. But in this case, a simple trace, cut, and flush trim process is the most efficient method in my humble opinion. And with the profile traced on each of the blanks, I'm going to jump over to the bandsaw and rough cut these in the same manner I did for the pattern earlier. Because these pieces will get flush trimmed to shape using a router bit instead of sanded to shape using a drum sander, I don't have to be as particular with the margin between the cut and the pencil line, because it's much easier to remove that excess with a router bit than a sanding drum. So the process is really quick and works equally well if you're using a scroll saw or a jigsaw to make these cuts instead of a band saw. Now I can finally put the pattern to use. So I take one of the blanks I just cut on the bandsaw, take the pattern, push them both up against the fence, and align the front and back of the pattern and the blank. Then I drive a number 19 by 1/2 inch nail into each of the pre-drilled pilot hole locations that I laid out earlier. These strategically placed nails serve to both attach the pattern to the blank and also to quickly and accurately transfer the center points for the aluminum bars from the pattern to the blank for future use. And now, with the pattern attached firmly to the blank, I'm ready for the next step, which is to flush trim the blank to the pattern. And I'll do that with the PowerLift Pro router lift in the table by setting the bit height with the PowerLift Pro app, where a quick touch on the touchscreen lowers a 1/2 inch flush trim bit to the exact height necessary for the bearing to follow the pattern and the cutters to trim the blank flush. So I fire up the router, let it ramp up to full speed, and then carefully but quickly flush trim the parabolic curve from the template onto the blank. Now I simply lather, rinse, repeat to create 6 identical sides for these 3 pullouts. With the pullout sides nearly complete, I'll stop for a minute and ask you to consider subscribing to Next Level Carpentry if you haven't already. And you'd help me out by hitting the thumbs up button if you like this video and videos like this that go deep into the weeds with extra details on how things get made. And I see it as basically premium content without a paywall. So I hope you'll do those things for me here at the Next Level Carpentry Channel. During the video, I've mentioned a number of tools and products, the PowerLift Pro, the Lambert Chuck, etc. There'll be other supplies used in the video. And there's links to most of that stuff in the video description below if you're after any of those things. But I'm just telling you about those things here in the video because that's what I use here in the shop. None of those people are sponsoring the video, although purchases made through any of those links do provide a little bit of ad revenue that helps support the channel. Speaking of supporting the channel, you can go to Spring where you can get t-shirts like this. There's a couple silly posters around the shop you can find in that link there. And I already mentioned patrons on Patreon who get in-depth insight into various things going on here in the shop, like that sanding drum organizer, in-depth tutorials on how to use the joiner, etc. So if you're motivated at all to become a patron of the channel, follow the link to Patreon in the video description. Check it out, sign up, and I'll thank you in advance for that. And I agree, that's about enough self-promotion for one video, so I'll quit there, get back to work, and talk about the next step on these pull-out sides, which is to create a rabbet that'll help in assembly. If you are familiar with Russian birch plywood, this 1/4 inch stuff has kind of like an A side and a B side. I want the A side to be on the outside because the inside of these pull-outs will be full of stuff, and this will be visible when they're pulled out. So I separated these out into left and right sides. So I've got 3 left sides and 3 right sides with the good face facing out. And the reason that's important is that the next step is to cut a small rabbet on the bottom edge of the inside of each of the side panels. And I want to make sure that I'm cutting the rabbet on the right face of the plywood. So I quickly draw a rough mark on the inside face on the bottom edge of each of the sides so I don't lose track of which is what while making the cut. I'll be using a full curve flat top grind rip blade for making these small rabbets so that they come out crisp, clean, and consistent. I carefully set the blade height so that it matches the thickness of the bottoms of the pullouts, which in this case is about 9/16 of an inch because the 1/2 inch particle board has laminate on one face and a backer sheet on the other. The purpose of these shallow rabbets is to make assembly of the pullouts easier, and it also increases the strength of the pullout overall when it's complete. So the rabbets need to be accurate and consistent, and to achieve that, I'll just do a test cut on a scrap to make sure the settings are what I'm after. As you may know, the overall thickness of this Russian birch plywood can vary. So for ease of measurement and dimensioning, I want to make sure the part that remains is exactly 3/16 of an inch, and any variance in thickness we'll end up in a variance in the depth of the rabbet, which isn't a factor for this particular situation. So with the preliminary setting for the height of the rabbet, I set the rib fence at 3/16 of an inch and make the test cut to double check those settings. You might appreciate the fact that I did some fiddling and adjusting with these settings off camera to dial them in so that the height of the rabbet is exactly the thickness of the bottom and that the material remaining after making the rabbet is indeed exactly 3/16 of an inch. Once the setup is made and verified, I quickly run the rabbet on the bottom edge of the inside face of each of these 6 pull-out sides. Bada bing, bada boom. Now that the shape of the sides is complete and the rabbets are cut, I want to give each of these pieces a next level touch by adding a thumbnail profile to the 3 exposed edges of these sides, because it gives the whole pullout a more professional, pleasing fit, feel, and finish. And it's quick and easy to do by using an 1/8 inch round over bit in this Bosch Colt palm router. And I've got this, the 1/8 inch round over bit set a little bit shallow so it won't do a full bullnose edge on the pieces, but it gives it a nice, classy thumbnail profile, even though these pieces are quite thin. In this close-up shot, you can see that the bit isn't set to its full depth to create a full round over profile, but it will cut a partial 1/8 inch radius arc that eases the corners on both faces of the pull-out sides for a functional and pleasing thumbnail profile. I use a relatively high RPM and a relatively slow feed rate so that the resulting cut is smooth and not rough like it would be with less RPM and a faster feed rate, which makes for less sanding before staining. And everyone knows Next Level Carpentry hates sanding. And adding that thumbnail profile to each of the pull-out sides completes the shaping process for the pull-out sides, but there's still a little homework left to do by way of drilling pilot holes for screws that will be used during assembly. For the first set of holes, I use an 1/8 inch brad point bit to drill pilot holes for screws that will attach the aluminum bars later, using the small imprint left by nails during the flush trimming process as a guide for the center of these holes. To make sure the pilot holes are crisp and clean, I use a fresh spot on the insert on the drill press table to prevent blowout and high RPM on the bit for nice clean cuts. And like all the other steps in this build, the actual drilling is quick and easy. And I further speed up the drilling process by adding a mag switch drill press fence that's set to exactly 3/8 of an inch away from the center point of the drill bit, which speeds up the process of centering the bit on the mark for drilling these holes. Next, I'll add marks for screws that will hold the sides to the bottom of the pullout later. Since the bottoms are a 1/2 inch thick, these screws will be a 1/4 inch up off the bottom edge of the pullout side. I'll put marks at 1.5 inches off the front and back of the side, and then space 3 more screws 5 inches apart between the front and back screws, for a total of 5 screws to hold the side to the bottom. I'll use number 7 by 3/4 inch flathead screws to hold the sides to the bottom. So I switch the setup at the drill press to a small snappy countersink bit and add an auxiliary fence to drill these holes a 1/4 inch away from the bottom edge of the pullout sides. And again, using a high RPM and a preset depth stop, quickly pilot and countersink 5 holes along the bottom edge of each of the pullout sides. Hello! 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 Well, I just wanted to check if anybody was still with me at this stage of the build, because we've taken so many steps so far to get these parts to this stage. And as it turns out, there's still one more important and critical step left, and that is to attach the drawer part of the sliding drawer hardware to the sides of the pullouts themselves. And for everyone that's still watching, pay close attention, because this is a little more challenging than you might think, but I've got a next level solution for you that's an elegant way to deal with this particular challenge. And the challenge is how to fasten the drawer hardware to this thin plywood side, because normally this type of hardware is put on with 1/2 inch long panhead screws screwed into a thicker panel, one that's a 1/2 inch, 5/8 or maybe even 3/4 of an inch thick. But in this case, a screw any longer than 1/4 of an inch is going to stick through the inside of this and be an unsightly solution. So what I came up with is binder pin screws that'll attach this securely to the sides of these pullouts, which to me is a more elegant solution than using a 1/2 inch long screw, running it through the plywood and then just grinding the pointy end off on the inside of the pullout. So let me show you what those look like, in case you're not familiar with what I'm talking about. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a binder post screw. It's comprised of a very thin flathead screw with machine threads on it that screws into this little piece here and provides a very strong machine thread screw connection between the two parts. This particular binder post is a 3/16 inch diameter and a 3/16 inch length. And I got that size so that the machine screws here will fit nicely through the holes in the sides of these drawer glides. And the length of the post itself at 3/16 of an inch is just a little bit shy of the thickness of this plywood. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that these drawer glide mounting blocks are a full 2 inches wide, which now comes into play when I install this piece on the slide of the pullout. And to make everything line up and work out, I'll install the center of this slide here at exactly 1 inch up off the bottom of the pullout side. When this piece gets mounted to this, it won't be mounted at the center at 2 inches. It'll be mounted at 1 1/16 of an inch off the bottom, which will hold the pullouts a 1/16 inch above the bottom of this block. And I'll have to mention that again when I go to attach that hardware. But for now, what that means is this piece needs to be mounted with the center exactly 1 inch up from the bottom of the side. And the way this hardware works out, the front of the glide needs to line up with the front of the pullout itself. And to accomplish that, I start by drawing a center line exactly 1 inch up off the bottom of the pullout side using a Starrett double square for a clean, accurate mark. Once that center line is established, I take the drawer hardware piece, line it up with the front of the pullout side, and then center the center line in the holes in the glide, and then mark the location of 3 of the holes in the glide onto the center line on the pullout side. Just like that. Once I've marked those 3 holes on each of the pullout sides, it's back to the drill press where I've chucked a 3/16 inch brad point bit into that Lambrick chuck, set the mag switch fence to exactly 1 inch away from the center of the bit, so I can proceed to quickly and accurately drill all the holes for the binder post screws to attach the drawer glide to the pullout side. Of course, I could have spent a little more time and paid a little more attention to the setup for drilling those holes and probably gang cut all these sides at the same time, but even by marking them and drilling them individually, it just took a few minutes to get this part done. And now I can show you what this looks like attaching that part of the glide to this part of the pullout. Once all the holes are drilled, all it takes to attach the drawer glide to the side of the pullout is to press the threaded part of the binder pin bolt into the pre-drilled hole on the inside of the pullout side, and then flip the side piece over, line up the holes in the drawer glide, and drive the machine screw portion of the binder pin screw into the threaded part to firmly hold the glide to the side. And even though there's more than a few steps involved, that really is all it takes to attach that drawer glide to this thin pullout side with a connection that's much stronger than threaded screws into even a 1/2 inch side panel. And I think it's quite an elegant solution for that little predicament. This segment is going to play a little bit funny because I'm shooting it out of sequence, but I want to show you how the drawer glides get mounted to these installation blocks, so I'm just going to cover that now. As I've explained, these glides are going to get mounted closer to the top of the block than to the bottom, which means there's going to be left and right sided blocks, so I'll mark them accordingly with the center line 1 1/16 inches up from the bottom. And I can tell you that is awkward to do in the camera. But once the center lines are drawn, I need to locate the glides front and back on these mounting blocks. And if you recall, the total distance from the back of the cabinet to the front is 23.5 inches. And these blocks are a little short, so they fit inside the cabinet. So I just place one of the glides on the mounting block and measure a little less than 23.5 inches to the front of the glide. So I'm going 23 7/16 of an inch. And then I just put a mark at the back of the glide so I know the correct distance front and back to mount these so the overall length is correct. And for this hardware in this cabinet, that distance turns out to be 1 5/8 inches. So I just transfer that mark onto each of the glide installation blocks for reference. Once I've got marks for the center line and the back, I can install the glide, and I do that by pulling out the drawer section of the glide to expose the screw holes. And make note that I put the screws into these tabs because they have flexibility for the drawer glides to make up for any inconsistencies in the width of the pullout. And I'll just install screws in the back, the middle, and the front tabs on the blocks. For this particular hardware, there's a hole in the back that's designed for a flathead screw. So I'll start by aligning the back of the glide on the mark and the center of that hole on the center line, and drive that flathead screw that holds the self-closing mechanism in position. Next, I'll use a number 8 by 1/2 inch very thin penhead screw to attach the tabs on the glide onto the block. And I just slide this part back and forth to expose the hole that I need to work with, which is this one right here. And that's all it takes to mount that hardware onto those blocks. Now every block is going to be a bit different depending on the cabinet, and this hardware tends to be kind of similar but not exact. So screw locations, screw types, dimensions, etc. are going to be different from project to project. But the takeaway is that when the drawer is installed, or when the pullout's installed, the bottom of the pullout's going to be above the bottom level of this block. So the block can sit directly on the back of the cabinet, and the drawer will slide in and out with clearance. And the location of the glide front to back means that, I've got to trigger this little thing, means that the front of the glide is 1/16 of an inch behind the back side of the door, so that door can always close when the glide is fully retracted. I don't want those to be the same dimension. You might feel more comfortable with a little more space, 1/8 of an inch or so underneath and in front, and just make adjustments accordingly. But that's what it takes to install this part of the glide to this glide mounting block. One more final note. If your pullouts are a little on the narrow side like mine are going to be, just take a putty knife or some such, slip it behind the glide, between the glide and the block, and just give it a little wiggle. And that'll bend those tabs out and put a little bit of flex between the glide and the block, and allow the drawer or the pullout to slide in and out without undue friction on the hardware itself. But now that you've seen that part, I'll jump back to where I cut in with this segment and show you the rest of the build. And over at the tool chest, you can see how well this side fits into the glide that's already installed in the cabinet, where the full extension and self-closing features work just like they're intended. With all those side pieces complete to this stage, there's one more tricky part of this build, but before I get to that, I'll go over making the bottom panels for the pullouts first, because it's probably the quickest and easiest part of the build. And as a quick recap, the interior width dimension of the cabinet is 12 7/8 inches. The drawer hardware takes up a minimum of 1 inch, so the maximum width for a pullout is going to be 11 7/8 inches. So I'll take these two sides over to the vise and work backwards from that dimension. Because the easiest way to figure out the cut width for that bottom is to take the two sides with the rabbeted faces opposing each other and hold them in the vise so they're tight together. And then I just hold 11 7/8 inches on this side and read 11 1/2 inches on this side. So the maximum width for the bottom is 11 1/2 inches. But as I said earlier, these pullouts are much better if they're too loose than too tight. So normally I'd go 11 7/16 inches for the bottom width, but in this case, I'm going to go 11 3/8 just to make sure the pullouts aren't too tight in the cabinet. So for these pullouts, the width of the bottom is 11 3/8 inches, and for any pullout, the bottom is the same length as the sides, which, going back to earlier in the video, is exactly 23 inches. So I just need to have 3 bottom pieces that are 11 3/8 by 23, and as you can see, I pre-cut these when I was making the other pullouts. So I already have my piece for the bottom, and I already told you that this is a 1/2 inch thick. That's a good thickness. It's sturdy, it's lightweight, etc. You could go a little thinner, a little thicker if other factors take precedence. But on this one, I just cut this particle board with an exposed, which left an exposed particle board edge. And I wanted a next level look to the project, so I mitered the fronts. And I took video before showing how that process is done. So let me cut to that before I come back to this. The process of putting a mitered front edge on the bottoms of these pullouts is pretty straightforward and basically involves mitering the end of the pullout bottom to a sharp 45-degree angle and then making mitered strips with cross-grain laminate to fit on the front edge. I use my favorite Starbond CA glue and accelerator to glue the mitered edging on the front of the pullout bottom, which goes quick and easy with this sequence. First, I use frog tape to line up the mitered edges and hold them in place. And as you'll see, the frog tape also acts as a perfect clamp for holding the edging to the bottom for 10 seconds while the glue sets. Notice I overlap the two mitered edges just a little bit, then carefully spray accelerator on one face of the miter, flip the shelf over, and apply a couple strips of that medium flexible Starbond CA glue to the other face. Once all that's set up, I just flip the mitered edge 180 degrees and hold it for 10 seconds while that CA glue grabs and sets. And voila, the mitered laminate edge is complete. Because a cut mitered edge on a piece of laminate is sharper than a Ginsu knife, I use a small fine file to take a few licks on the mitered corner so that it looks nice but doesn't slice my pinkies if I'm not careful. And the result is a perfectly mitered corner with matching grain wrapping around, just for a nice look. And I didn't bother doing the back end of the pullout or anything like that. This edge could also be done with some edge banding or T-edge, or heck, just left as raw particle board and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But that's all it takes to make the bottoms. And because these sides are rabbeted, it's really easy to screw the side to the bottom. And even though these aren't stained and lacquered yet, I'm going to show you that step now as a segue to the next step, which will be making these aluminum bars. And because I did my homework, this is super simple to do. I just clamp one of the bottoms in the vise with the top face facing up, front edge facing this way, and then I take the appropriate pull-out side with that rabbet facing down. And because there's a rabbet on there, this piece doesn't squirm around, it just indexes exactly to the top of that pull-out. Slide this forward until it's flush on the front, like that, which means it's also flush on the back. Slide this into place. Use the same snappy pilot countersink bit to chase through the holes I drilled on the drill press. And then drive a number 7 by 3/4 inch flathead screw into the hole. Just like that, perfectly installed. And you can see here, when I slide this side around, it won't go any farther than that rabbet will let it. So it's real easy to line everything up and pilot the holes. And just like that, the side is firmly secured to the bottom. And because I spent a few minutes putting a rabbet on the side, it's super simple to attach the second side as well. Just slip this into place, let the rabbet do its work. And pilot a hole and drive a screw. That holds it in place just where it needs to be. While I pilot the other holes and get ready to drive screws. And by piloting those screws, I don't risk blowing out the particle board when the screws are driven. Especially the ones close to the end, they can delaminate that particle board, but they don't in this situation. And just like that, the sides are attached to the bottom in a perfect fit. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's a perfectly clean, straight joint between the side and the bottom here because of that rabbet again. And that brings me to what I see as the last tricky part of this build, and that is to put these aluminum bars in here that act as guardrails for the contents of the pullouts. And I considered other options, like making this more like a drawer, putting box joint or finger jointed corners on the back and just using the same plywood for the front and the back. but I didn't want to do that. Wanted to kind of keep this minimalist. Wanted to be able to see through it, contents. If there's something in the back of the cabinet, I just want to be able to see it. And so I decided to use hardware for the front and back instead of plywood. But that presented the problem of what sort of hardware is going to work for this. And I decided on bars. I was going to use wooden dowels, but I was afraid if they got bumped, they would split out. So I wanted metal, and naturally for metal, I chose aluminum because it's easier to work with. It's not going to rust, etc. And so I came up with a system for attaching these to this. And the first step in doing that was cutting bars to the right length to fit between. This fits snug at the bottom and just gets pinched in between like that. Remember when we were building this, we created those pilot holes. That'll hold it in, but I still needed to come up with a workable, repeatable way to attach the bars to the plywood that was both simple and strong. So let me show you what that process looks like. And it's the same process I used for cutting all these bars for these pullouts when I was making the other ones. But with a couple of pro tips, it's quick, easy, and repeatable. So let me take you through the steps that I used to make these. And no surprise, the first step in making the hardware is to come up with a dimension for a nice snug fit of these rods between the sides, which in this case is exactly 11¼ inches. Cut the 3/8 inch diameter aluminum rod with whatever means you have at your disposal, as long as the ends come out crisp, clean, and square, which in my case is this amazing 15-inch Evolution metal cutting chop saw that makes quick, clean work of the task. 3 pullouts, 4 bars per pullout, means a total of 12 bars for this build. In fact, the Evolution saw does such an amazing job of cutting the rod crisp and clean that I actually have to take a small file to soften those sharp corners so that the rod doesn't dig into the plywood sides of the pullout during installation. When I decided to use aluminum rod for this, back when I was designing the pullouts, I kind of racked my brain for a while figuring out a good way to attach them. And I was thankful for coming up with an easy solution, which involves using a small panhead wood screw and a little hack to make it work. For attaching the rods to the sides, I chose these number 8 by 1/2 inch Phillips panhead screws that I normally use for attaching drawer hardware to drawers because they've got a nice big washer head on them for secure holding power, and a coarse thread is perfect for screwing into the aluminum rods. So I just chuck a rod in the vise to hold it, and then carefully use a Starrett center marking square to mark the center on each end of the rods. And once the center is marked, I use a punch to dimple that center point for drilling. Once the ends of the rods are center marked, I take them over to the drill press, slip the rod into a 3/8 hole drilled vertically into the face of a block, and drill a hole about a 1/2 inch deep straight into the end of the center of the rod. I'm using vice grips with duct tape to pad the jaws for holding the soft aluminum rod so it doesn't get marred in the process. But this is a pretty quick and slick way to drill an 1/8 inch pilot hole into both ends of the rods to accept the screws for installation. And this somewhat unique setup allows me to drill holes in both ends of the rods with no trouble at all. And personally, I think this setup is pretty tough to beat considering the end result I get when it's done. Because that's all it takes to firmly secure the two sides of this pullout together, assure that things don't tip off the back of the pullout when it's in the cabinet, and the bar in the front not only keeps things from sliding off the front of the pullout, but also serves as a perfect handle for pulling out and pushing in the finished pullouts in the cabinet. And now that you know all the ins and outs of creating custom pullouts for a metal tool cabinet, I can disassemble this one and sand the parts along with the rest of the pieces I made for these 3 pullouts, give them a coat of stain and lacquer, and then return for final assembly to wrap up the video. Even though this is new Russian birch plywood, it still needs to be cleaned up before staining and lacquering. So I remove pencil marks left behind from layout with an oops eraser, and then give both faces a thorough going over with 180 grit sandpaper on a random orbit sander. And to me, a thorough going over means a full pass back and forth across the grain on the whole face of a piece, followed by an equally thorough pass with the grain back and forth until the full surface has been covered both directions. And on this project, I'm using this electric Bosch 5-inch random orbit sander. It's got a 5-inch diameter pad here, which I don't normally use. I've got another sander that I use most of the time, but I'm also beta testing these purple discs These are zirconia discs that the folks at Starbond are checking into for an additional product line to the amazing Starbond CA glues that I use all the time. I got a selection of these. I'm using the 180 grit for this plywood just to give it a nice smooth finish. But these are zirconia, and the grit is just remarkably sharp. And as zirconia, it's designed to stay sharp longer, which is a wonderful thing. I've been working on these for a while. This disc is still plenty sharp. You can see while I'm sanding how much dust it's creating. Some of it gets sucked up by this little bag. My other Mirka sander, 99% of the dust gets sucked up. But with this sander, you can see how much material is being removed, how quickly it cleans and smooths the surfaces. And I'm not sure what the status is with these discs on the Starbond website, but if they're available now, there'll be a link in the video description to them. But I can say, while using these discs on this project right now, that I'm going to give it an official Next Level Carpentry 5-star review. I really like the way these work. And I want to thank Joe and the team at Starbond for sending me these discs to beta test. But once the surfaces have been sanded with that, I'm just using an old Abernet screen, and I'll do the edges. I think this is 150 grit, but I'll just do those thumbnail edges to smooth them up. The router bit left a nice even, smooth surface, but this just smooths it down, makes it nice to the touch when the pullouts are all done. And because of the process used to create the thumbnail edge, this is quick, easy, and successful. And this is plywood after all, so I'm extra cautious sanding the edges, because regardless of how good the sandpaper is plywood, and I want to avoid splinters. Once all the sanding is done, I blow loose dust off of all the pieces and spread them out on my work surface for staining. I use a Purdy 2.5-inch ox hair brush to apply a full wet coat of Minwax Classic Gray stain to both faces and all the edges of all the pieces. And FYI, neither Minwax or Purdy are sponsoring this video, but I think you'll agree that this ox hair brush does an amazing job when applying stain, because the bristles hold so much that it doesn't take many dips to apply the stain on this soft material. And then follow up using a dry brush to remove excess stain and even out blotchiness that's common on this soft Russian birch plywood. And once the stain is applied and evened out, I stand the pieces on end so circulating air dries the stain on both sides at the same rate. And whenever I'm done staining, I give my brushes the TLC they deserve by thoroughly rinsing them in an appropriate solvent. And once the stain is rinsed clean, they get an energetic spin with a brush spinner until the bristles are dry before they get slipped back into their protective sleeve for safe storage until the next time they're called into service. After letting the stain dry, I fill my 3M AccuSpray gun with pre-catalyzed lacquer and give both faces of all 6 sides a thorough wet coat. This coat acts as a sealer, which dries in about an hour and locks down loose wood fibers on the surface. After the sealer coat dries, I use 320 grit sandpaper to thoroughly sand both faces and all edges to permanently remove nibs and roughness from the surface. Then I use a soft cloth to remove lacquer powder from the surface, lay the pieces out on spray sticks, and finish up with a second full wet coat of dull rub effect lacquer and leave the pieces to dry overnight. After the second coat of lacquer has thoroughly dried, I use a brown paper bag, which, in my opinion, is the world's finest sandpaper, to give the pieces a once-over that removes roughness from overspray and any tiny nibs that floated in the finish before it dried. And with this step, the finishing process is complete and the side panels are ready for final assembly. You gotta love it when a plan comes together, even though a video showing everything it takes to make the plan come together takes an hour of your time. But with all the fabrication steps complete and the lacquer finish dried, final assembly of these pullouts goes smoothly and quick. I start by reattaching the cabinet side of the drawer glides to the drawer glide installation block with 1 flathead screw and 3 panhead screws, just like I showed you earlier in the video. After that, I'll use those binder post screws to attach the drawer side of the drawer glides to the pull-out sides. And I think I'm finally getting the name right for those binder post screws. And notice the effect those coats of lacquer had on the holes for the binder posts, because now I need to drive them in with a plastic-faced mallet. But that's a good thing, because it holds them more firmly in place. And if you search the term "when a plan comes together" on Wikipedia, you'll see a link to this timestamp in this video, because this is just about as close as a plan coming together as you'll ever find, in my humble opinion. And if you didn't already, I think now you can appreciate the payoff for time invested in rabbeting these pull-out sides and pre-drilling all these holes for hardware and assembly. And now, as W.C. Fields might have said, it's time for the coup de grace. As I drive in the final 8 panhead screws to hold the aluminum bars in place in the pullouts. So that the final step is to install the drawer hardware glide blocks into the cabinets and install the pullouts themselves. Oh yeah. And with the cabinet cleaned out, I can remove the existing stationary shelf just by lifting it out and removing the clips, which completely frees up the space for installing pullouts. So I start by slipping left and right drawer glide blocks into the bottom of the cabinet and holding them in place with the 1/4 inch MDF spreader bar. And note that the blocks can be a little difficult to install with the drawer glides attached, but once they're in position, they snap snugly into place and hold firmly. Once the glides and blocks are in place, the pullout slips easily into the hardware. And because I did my homework, the pullout slides effortlessly. Once the first pullout is in place, I take a quick measurement to verify the height needed for spacing for the second pullout from the bottom at 9 inches. And that measurement will allow about a 1/2 inch of space between the top of the bottom pullout and the bottom of the second pullout. So I quickly cut some vertical spacer blocks that are about 11 inches wide and 9 inches high to support and separate the pullouts in the cabinet. Then I simply drop those spacer blocks into place, slip in the next pair of left and right drawer glide blocks, and keep them in position with the spreader block at the back. And I must admit, I'm feeling a bit lucky because I haven't encountered any conflicts with screws or rivets in the front frame of the cabinet yet. And just like that, the second pullout slides in as easily as the first. Unfortunately, my luck was short-lived, and I had to make a couple dado notches to get the glide blocks to fit around riv nuts in the sides of the cabinet. But it's a small price to pay and no big deal because of the storage efficiency I gain with these pullouts. I didn't fully appreciate how lucky I was in avoiding rivets and screws on all the previous sets of pullouts because it took a while to figure out what notches were required to clear the riv nuts in the back of the cabinet and the screws in the front. But with persistence, I figured it out and learned that I just need to slip the glide blocks into place above their final position and could use a rubber mallet to tap them down into place on top of their support blocks with comparatively little effort. And ultimately I won the day and was able to slip the glide blocks into place, even though now it requires a different spreader block at the back to hold the glides in place. Thankfully, once I discovered, addressed, and resolved all those little difficulties, the third pullout slips in and soft closes like the others, just like it needs to. And I'm thankful to report that my unlucky streak was short-lived, so that after slipping in a couple of support blocks between the upper glide and the top of the cabinet to lock all the glides in place, the top shorter pullout that I made previously slides into place without issue. And it occurs to me as I stand back in this corner banging my head on these shelves that a smarter person probably would have done these glides on the other cabinet for the video, but at least it goes to show you what can be done in less than ideal circumstances. And I can finally look forward to loading up those pullouts and getting that cabinet organized. And now that this somewhat epic build video is finally complete, I'll say, as always, and until next time, thanks for watching. This cabinet is a mess. That was annoying. I need to fix it. I'll make some pullouts.
That was easy.
Naturally, my opinion is biased, but I think that's a little more like it. What do you think?